Go watch part 1 and 2 first. Let's just get straight into this. If there's two things I will never complain about in a matchup, it's if it involves either A, an animated film character, or B, a villain. So what happens when you combine them? Syndrome vs Titan wasn't always on my radar. I do still really like Homelander vs Titan, but with Hancock in the picture now, that matchup has lost quite a bit of its appeal. So why Syndrome vs Titan? Well, in terms of thematics, it's two quote-unquote nice guys who get rejected by the one person they looked up to the most, leading them on a path to villainy. With the interesting part being that neither of them are actually super. Hal got his powers accidentally from Megamind himself, and Buddy built his own tech inspired by Mr. Incredible. Like most people, I love Megamind 1, and Titan only elevates that love. And the same applies to the first Incredibles film, with both of them being among the top tier of animated villains for me, especially in Syndrome's case. This is a stat stomp for Hal, I believe, with Syndrome gaining a few advantages in versatility, smarts, and experience, which can be incorporated into the fight quite easily. The only thing I'd want from this fight is lots of destruction and seeing Hal fight off a bunch of Syndrome's Omnidroids. I could also see a lyrical Brandon track in the same vein as Diabolical Invincible Me, and since both have only been in one film each, it'll be easy enough on the research team as well. So there's zero reason why they can't do this. Horror matchups. You either love him or you hate him. After Jason vs Michael, I think we can all agree we needed a redemption arc ASAP, and I know the perfect way to do so. Freddy Krueger vs Pennywise. I'm going to keep this brief since we all know this one's popular enough to happen now. For good reason as well. Both of these are reality warpers in the same vein as Bill and Discord, so as long as the crew spend some time on the choreography here, we'd be in for a season highlight for sure. The debate seems to be alright as well. I've heard some decent arguments for Freddy, but I'd still put my money on Pennywise. I don't have any investment in either franchise, I just know this one would appeal to me personally. This probably won't be season 11's Halloween episode, but I think we're all hoping it is. Earlier, I mentioned wanting Spidey back for a second episode. In the same vein, I think Wolverine is due for a return as well. So, who are his options? I've seen John Talbane tossed around, and that could be cool, but he doesn't need a return. There's a Predator, which, no. Zorro is another option, but I'd rather a rematch with Urza than anything. And lastly, there's Guts. But if you need to bring Guts back, put him against Claire. So who do I want? Bigby Wolf. I love The Wolf Among Us, and I've heard the Fables comics are actually quite interesting. The gist of this one is that both of them have rough exteriors due to their tragic pasts, but eventually learn to settle down and move forward with their new groups. That being said, both still have a ruthless animalistic side that they're not afraid to bust out, with insane healing factors to boot. It only makes sense for this one to start in a bar, which would mean we wouldn't get to see the spandex, but meh, I'll live. Bigby would likely be investigating Logan as potential suspect for a crime, and Logan will naturally get defensive. As the fight progresses, both of them will lose more and more control, with the winner eventually regaining their senses and taking a moment to breathe before dealing the killing blow. And they probably could have an emotional ending here, with them feeling a bit of regret. I assume Logan wins this, which would please the vast majority luckily. And if you like Blood Moon, I imagine the track here would be similar. We need more comic franchise outside of Marvel and DC, and this is a great place to start. Freddy vs Pennywise isn't the only fear-related matchup on this list. Mysterio vs Scarecrow is probably the community's most wanted Marvel vs DC matchup. And for good reason, there's infinite animation potential for this one, at least on Mysterio's side. You can have Mysterio inflict whatever illusions you want on Crane, allowing for some insane set pieces. Have Scarecrow fight off an army of illusions, maybe of different DC supervillains. Then near the end, have Scarecrow finally land his fear toxin on Beck, showing off his worst fear, either killing him or fueling him to break out of his hallucinations. I believe this one's actually fairly debatable as well, not really coming down to stats at all, which is always a win. I have no real personal attachment to these two, but I know after Bailcord we'd be in for something special, something lacking in comic book matchups nowadays. You may have noticed I've mentioned Street Fighter quite a few times on this list so far, so there was no way I was going to leave out my favourite character, Akuma. Every iconic character deserves 3 episodes, just no more than that please. and Akuma is no exception here. According to the community, he's not had a good episode yet really, so this is his last chance to prove his worth in an animation. So who are his options? There's Garo, who murders him nowadays. There's Tai Long, which would be interesting, but Akuma just god stomps. And there's Yujiro, who, memes aside, would be interesting, but my personal pick is Rao. I'll admit, I have yet to experience any Fist of the North Star media, but Rao seems exactly like the type of character I usually gravitate towards liking. Both want nothing more than a good fight, and seek to push that out of their rivals until they eventually rise up and defeat them. It's a simple premise, but it works so well. This should of course be done in sprites, unless you can get a custom only that doesn't piss off most of your fan base. I have no idea what the choreography could be like, just make it pretty and emphasize the impact of each hit, and we'll have another Heihachi vs Geese on our hands. There's actually a debate here in the same vein as Akuma vs Shao Kahn. I've heard some of the researchers like this one as well, and with Akuma's return to Street Fighter 6 coming soon, this should be gaining more attention. Earlier I mentioned that I really want another TF2 matchup, and my most wanted out of these has got to be Sarge vs Soldier. It's strange to me that we've had 2 Red vs Blue episodes so far, and they've both been same series fights. And with TF2 seemingly never dying, why wouldn't you bring it back? Spy vs 47 would also be cool, mind you, but this offers so much more in terms of its personality. Have them both yell at each other about how patriotic they are for their country and teams, whilst complimenting each other for their love of firearms. I don't know what the choreography could look like, but I have no doubt would be in for a good time. Sarge stomps, which doesn't bother me too much since he was my favourite character in the 3 seasons of RVB that I did actually watch. I also think that this is likely for season 11, which makes me very excited. This one is probably the most difficult to put into production. The Disney Princess Battle Royale feels like it'd be impossible to pull off properly, mainly because there's over 10 characters involved here, so the episode would likely have to be 40 plus minutes, which would be very cool, but not very realistic. Sure, you could cut it down to just 5 or 6 of them, but that kinda defeats the purpose of plotting them all against each other. Some of them aren't fighters, and that's okay. I've heard Ariel wins if you give her Triton's Trident, which I don't know how to feel about since that's not standard arsenal for her. Otherwise, I'd assume Elsa or Rapunzel would win. Hopefully Rapunzel, since Tangled is one of my favorite Disney movies. This could be an excuse to do a musical episode too, since Ben and Chad have expressed interest in that idea. Maybe this would work better as a DBX between just a few of them, just so we can test the waters a bit, but we'll see. Recently, I watched through Amphibia for the first time. Take a guess which matchup I was expecting to happen this season. My favourite character from the show was definitely Marcy, but I don't have a matchup I like for her yet sadly. However, I do have one for my second favourite, King Andreas. The dude just oozes charm and charisma, and I feel like we could get an interesting analysis out of him should he come to the show. So who are his options? Well, truth be told, I was originally going to go with Bellows, but I figured that wouldn't be too interesting, despite how much enjoyment I'd personally get out of it. There's Lord Genome, but I think the scale of that matchup would be too high for Andreas. Then there's the Ancient Minister, which would be really funny, despite how much sense it actually makes if you think about it. And there's Movie Bowser, which I would also like. However, the matchup I've gone for is of course Andreas vs Asgore. Kind-hearted kings at first, but both hide their true intentions to the main human protagonist. They both seek to conquer humanity through any means necessary, but eventually realize their wrongdoings and seek to redeem themselves. I'll admit I've never played Undertale, crazy, I know, but I am aware that the tragic aspect of both of these kings could make for an excellent emotional ending. Not to mention Werewolf would absolutely cook with the track. Maybe a somber orchestral track. I hear the debate is decent as well, so long as you don't give Andreas stuff that isn't part of his standard arsenal. Spawn. We all love him. He's just so cool. And with his first episode against Kratos being in season 1, I think we can all agree he's overdue for a return. So who are his options? There's Demi-Fiend, who I don't care about, Doomslayer, which would be awesome, but I don't think I have an opinion on who we should face next. And there's Venom, which would be a cool way to cap off Venom's time on the show with the recent King in Black stuff in the comics. I'd honestly be okay with the latter two happening, but I do have one preference for him, Ghost Rider. The battle of two humans turned enslaved demons who eventually rise up to overthrow their masters. taking their place as King of Hell, with both punishing sinners with the weight of said sins. This matchup just works in every way, and I think I speak for everyone when I say I was disappointed with the announcement of Ghost Rider vs Lobo. Like, I still can't get my head around that matchup. Speaking of, I do think that episode being in Season 6 makes this idea less likely to happen, since it was during the Cutaway era, and to our knowledge we haven't had a single returner from said era. Anyways, this has so much potential, starting out as a battle to claim each other's throne, with both claiming that the other is too big of a sinner to let them live. You can have their chains clash off each other, as well as their fire-based abilities, and eventually have Zarathos and Leafa come out to conclude the fight. I presume Ghost Rider would win, which I'm okay with. I imagine the battle would end similarly either way, plus we all know Brandon would cook with the track for this. All in all, it's just a solid matchup you can't go wrong with. With the release of Mortal Kombat 1 last year, it brought back one of my most wanted fighters, Reiko. I love playing him since he matches my fighting game archetype of the neutral-based grappler. Naturally, I want to see him on the show, so who are his options? There's Fong, who does not exist and you can't convince me he exists. There's Urian, a character I quite like, but the connections don't work for me. Then there's Roy Burns. Whilst not bad connection-wise, it doesn't have what I'd want out of a Reiko fight. So who does? You probably haven't heard of this matchup, but allow me to present to you Reiko versus General Ram, the battle between two generals from ultra-violent franchises whose lives' purpose is to serve their leaders with undying loyalty, often to a fault. Both are feared for their immense power and usually fight with bladed weapons. I just think this vibes super well, just an all-out bloodbath with not much thought needed from a writing standpoint. Just have them throw each other around and endure a crap ton of hits and you'll have a season highlight for sure. If you use the usual Mortal Kombat low tier scaling, I believe that Reiko takes this pretty easily, but I've not seen Ram or just Gears and more in general be looked at too much from a versus standpoint. Plus, we all know Brandon could cock with this one. Hell, technically this is an MK vs KI matchup as well, since Ram was a guest in KI3. And there's part 3 done. I was questioning if I should even bother finishing this due to the recent news of Rooster Teeth shutting down, but I figured there's no point being a downer, and I still have hope. So, as always, I hope you enjoyed, and please, be excellent to each other.